We're going to call this public hearing. My name is Joe Hashem. I'm the Director of the Community Development Block Grant, the CDBG. Basically, a public hearing we have published twice, March 29th and April the 5th. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then I'm going to ask Jason to come up here for any particulars that you might have, any questions or specifics. Basically, the public hearing is something that we have to do. It's required by the federal government because we're using federal money. The city of Dearborn basically used the federal money through our department, which is a CDBG, for projects that may be located partially or fully within the 100-year floodplain. Use of the federal funds requires compliance with federal executive orders, floodplain management, and protection of wetlands. The subject projects that we are looking at are 3: housing rehabs, water main replacement, which is the Annapolis Avenue, Polk Avenue, and Williams Avenue, and code enforcement. That's where this particular floodplain falls under. So if you have any specific questions, it's supposed to be for the public. I don't see any public here. So Jason, if you want to take over from here, If you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask us anything.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, sir.
I was just going to quickly run through what the process is that we use in order to determine if there's any negative impacts to the floodplain, why we do it, the quick eight-step process that we use, and then I'll open up for any questions that you may have. The eight-step process is defined by the National Environmental Protection Act. We have to take a look at all the federal projects that we're funding through our CDBG program and to determine whether or not they're located within our 100-year floodplain. And as you know, within the city of Dearborn Heights, there are significant acreages within the city that are consumed by a 100-year floodplain. 3 projects in particular: the housing rehab, water main replacement on Annapolis Avenue, and code enforcement are the 3 that we evaluated. We've determined that all 3 may be partially or fully located within the 100-year floodplain. That's step 1. Step 2, we move on to an early public review. We go through a publication process where we notify the public that these 3 activities are being proposed and will be taking place within the 100-year floodplain, and allow them the opportunity to provide us with any comment they may have. We did not receive any public comment related to these 3 activities. So we move on next to step 3, where we prepare a floodplain investigation report to identify and evaluate alternatives to locating the projects within the floodplain. So in these 3 instances, with housing rehab, for example, at this time we don't know the exact addresses that the homes that we'll be assisting will be helped out with CDBG. At the time that we do determine the addresses and the clients that will be assisting with the rehab program, those applicants are required to have floodplain insurance. For the water main replacement, we took a look at alternatives to locating that project within the 100-year floodplain. The right-of-way that the existing water main exists on Annapolis Avenue is in the 100-year floodplain. Moving that outside of the right-of-way, outside of the 100-year floodplain on Annapolis Avenue is impossible, given that that entire area is consumed by 100-year floodplain. We are using a method of pipe bursting to replace those water lines. It will have a minimal impact to the right-of-way and to the environment there along Annapolis. So I feel that that method will not impact that area in a great deal. We will not be impacting the water runoff within the neighborhood. So we've determined through that evaluation process that the 100-year floodplain will not be negatively impacted. And finally, with code enforcement, that just by nature, the way that project is implemented, doesn't have any physical impacts to the environment. So that project actually falls to an exempt category where we'd have to do no further evaluation on whether or not that'll have a negative impact to the environment. Moving to our fifth step, we minimize harm and restore, preserve natural and beneficial values of the 100-year floodplain, as I mentioned, through the floodplain insurance with the housing rehab and with the water main replacement using a pipe bursting method. We feel that will minimize the harm to the 100-year floodplain within those areas. Once we go through all 5 of those steps, we move on to step 6, which is to reevaluate all of our alternatives. So we look back at the public comment that we received. We look back at the evaluations that we made based on methods of implementation and locations of the projects, and determine whether or not there are any reasonable alternatives to locating those projects within the 100-year floodplain. Step 7 is where we're at today, to report our findings publicly and give a public explanation of the activities that will take place within the 100-year floodplain and allow for any further public comment. We've developed a floodplain investigation report that was available for 15-day public comment period online and at city offices that has a more in-depth detail of what the floodplain investigation report has. We've provided a notice to the public within the newspaper and online, providing those details. And today we're here to report to you our findings, which we feel there are no practical alternatives to locating these 3 projects within the 100-year floodplain, and feel that they're justified to move forward to implementation, which is step 8, implementation. So with that, those are the details of the floodplain report and floodplain findings. I'll open it up to any questions or comments that you may have.
Anybody have any questions? Go ahead and ask them. You don't have to go through me.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
for a buyer who is pending with a purchase in a floodplain, buying a piece of real estate, how does that person get protected from the absence of knowledge in his hand that it's a floodplain, or are there mechanisms in place that force him to know that?
He's a buyer of a single-family home within
Yes.
the floodplain?
Yes.
At any time purchasing a single-family home, you're required to obtain homeowner's insurance.
But when is that information announced to the buyer?
The insurance company will do a valuation on whether or not that home is located within the floodplain, so that would be before the signing of a mortgage.
I could
Yeah,
pitch in a little bit on
Please.
that. So when you purchase the home, a good realtor will tell you up front, they should know if they're knowledgeable of the area, if it's in a floodplain. If they don't know, then they got to contact the city and find out if that particular property is in a floodplain. At least that's your first line of defense. Some do, some don't tell, some know, some don't know. The next line of defense is the mortgage company will typically let you know that that particular property falls in a floodplain, and they will require that in order to provide a mortgage, you have to get flood insurance before you can close the deal. Now, that creates a burden for a lot of purchasers because, their money is a certain amount of money for qualifying, and now they have an additional debt that they either anticipated or didn't anticipate that they have to pay additional funds towards. Where you run into a problem if you have an incompetent or unknowledgeable or whatever you want to call it realtor and doesn't point it out to a particular customer, the problem you have where purchasers will fall through the cracks is if they're buying on a land contract or cash. In that particular instance, there's no requirement to have flood insurance. You could get it for your own protection. That's on you. So what happens is a lot of times they buy it and then they're not required to have flood insurance, and they would never know about it unless they got a mortgage. And that's why you'll find sometimes if somebody has their home paid off, even if it's not a purchaser, they won't have flood insurance. So a buyer will ask the seller, well, do you have flood insurance? And the seller will say, well, no, I don't. They make the presumption that that means they're not going to need it, but that's not the case because the seller has their property paid off. And because it's paid off, there's no mortgage on it, they're not required to have flood insurance.
I see. So the mortgage lender is the principal stopgap of getting
Yes.
into
That's the one that pretty much can't screw it up. Whether they know it or not, it'll come up.
Okay.
Councilman
Yes.
Kaczynski,
Yes.
the state does provide maps to all banks and all entities such as real estate offices and what have you, where the flood zones are throughout the state of Michigan. So if you go to a bank and you want to buy a commercial building, for example, the people at the bank or whoever is responsible
up.
for that thing, they have to look it up and they have to make sure that you're not in a flood zone. If you are, they are to either require you to have the flood insurance or at least inform you, and then it'll be your decision whether to move forward or not.
And a lot of times for purchasers, they're surprised
So I
because
agree.
by the time they get to the mortgage company, where the mortgage company informs them
Yeah.
the purchase contract's already been accepted. And they've already put a deposit down, and now they get the surprise. So I've always trained people in our office, anything, especially south of Michigan Avenue, just double check with the city just to be on the safe side.
Is it a very expensive,
We keep copies of the flood maps in the libraries, and also that information is available on the city's website.
Okay. I'll mention that flood maps are in the libraries. I'm sure they're online as well if you look them up
On the city's website.
on the city's website.
what's a typical expense for a floodplain insurance policy?
To be honest with you, I have no idea. It's Dave might have a better idea.
On let's say, $90,000 property, you're probably looking at, depends on the type of insurance you end up getting, but you're probably looking at anywhere between $700 to $1,000 additional over and above your regular insurance. So when you have a first-time buyer, that's a major expense that they're surprised by.
That continues year after year.
Yeah.
Until often
Until the loan is paid off, and then it's at your
your
discretion if you want to
decision.
keep it or not.
And it's subsidized through FEMA.
Are there varying degrees of expense based on the severity of an area for floodplain? For example, one is
No.
more intense a potential for...
It's either a flood zone or not a
Yeah,
flood zone.
not that I'm aware of. It's like,
No,
It's either a flood zone or not a flood zone. If you're in a flood zone, you're required to get insurance.
right, it's either yes
It's
or
not
no.
like you're on the borders, you're either in the flood zone or you're not in a flood zone. However, I do appreciate all the questions. Those don't have any impact on what we're doing today. But we're more than happy to answer any more questions that you might have.
All right, I'm satisfied. Is there ever a reduction in the area of floodplain? So much so that the mortgagor who has been paying annually a flood insurance, and then the area is declared less potentially to be a floodplain?
That's something that comes from the state, I believe.
Well, I can
that-
somebody answer that, because, and Marge, you may remember, but Kurt Heisey kind of managed a program before I became mayor, and a lot of homes were removed from that floodplain.
Right.
They did new elevations with the help of Wade and Trim, and that had a significant impact. But as I recall, they look at the lowest point where the water would come into the household, and that becomes the measuring stick, and then it's how many feet above sea level you are, and then you get caught in the thing, because they'll come up with an average.
Right.
So even though, because I've had people who have given very strong arguments, but the elevation just didn't make it.
And I think their coverage is next to ridiculous, because I remember when we had the flood situation in South Heights a while back, most people's coverage was next to, I remember the number of 2,500 off the top of my head, that's all they were covered for.
And
The
often,
water's got to come inside, it can't be up the
It can't be from the
drainage.
sewer line,
Yeah,
right.
it's got to come in overland and through a window or door.
just AAA, I think, offers now sewer backup coverage for like an additional $600 every premium. But sometimes they cover it, sometimes they don't, like, sometimes for certain areas, they won't
Yeah.
offer it. And that was mainly the problem that people in the south end used to have, was the sewers backing
And a lot
up.
of people are, like the mayor mentioned, a lot of people are starting to get their properties off of the floodplain, contacting the city, and then there's a gentleman, I can't think of his name, but for like $250, he'll research and take you off of the floodplain.
There's a
if he
surveyor
could,
that'll,
surveyor and
you
stuff
have
like
to
that, yeah.
get the property graded.
Right.
I believe we do have a program through the administration that they have bought all the houses on Ecorse Creek.
Hanover.
All the foreclosures, we have bought them, tore them down, so there's no more houses. If the city has an option to buy these houses, we are buying them, tear them down, and just put grass in there, put nice lawn.
Yeah.
Any more
Other
questions? Anything? Anything from the public? All right, well, I want to thank you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Joe.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Joe.